This chapter is an introduction to military culture. It is essential for anyone working with the military or veteran populations. For everyone else, I want you to consider the military as a subculture. We're going to study it like an anthropologist would study any culture, to be honest. The veterans who leave the services take this culture with them and it impacts their lives. That is why this material is so important. I decided to leave out a number of things that are important, but we don't have time to cover them all. This includes a review of each rank within each service. It may also include things like pay structures and other benefits and important things in the military life. That said, there's still a lot of things to know before we get into veteran studies in particular. First, let me say that if you care anything about veterans, you should know something about the history of the organizations that they devoted a significant part of their lives to. Military history is veterans' history. So if you plan to work with veterans or just care about them, it's worth knowing something about military history. That said, and number two, this is not a military history class. We don't have time to go over 200 years of American military history. There are classes out there, and I hope you'll take some time to consider taking a class like that or reading some books on the topic. I will call your attention to a couple of important dates that I think you should know. First, I'll show my bias by giving you the date 10 November 1775. It's seared in my brain. It's the birth date of the U.S. Marine Corps. Attentive students will know why this is a bias for me. The other branches have very similar dates because American history, American military history started with the break of America from England. So our history doesn't go nearly as far back as it does for England. I also want you to know the date 1973. That is when the all-volunteer force started in the U.S. It was huge. It had huge ramifications for military culture today and hence veterans culture. For now, just know that veterans do not represent the entire nation quite the same as they did prior to 1973. That's when we had conscription, and theoretically it was supposed to draw people from all walks of life in America. You should also know the year 1990. That's when Operation Desert Shield started, but most importantly, that's when the total force policy was actually implemented. The total force policy meant that the reserves and active duty could be called to war or other needs whenever the U.S. government decides. Prior to that, that did not always happen. It's changed the way we live out war and hence changed veterans' lives forever. I'll give you one quick sidebar, and I want you to know that I had no intention in 1990 to go to war. My girlfriend's mother at the time said, David, aren't you worried about going to war? And I really didn't know a whole lot about what was going on, but I was thinking, no, I don't think so. They don't send the reserves to war. Well, 2 weeks or so after that conversation, I found my way down to North Carolina to start training to be sent overseas. Back to class. Okay, obviously, the most recent and longest wars include Afghanistan, and you should know that, roughly 2001 to 2021, and Iraq from 2003 to 2011. These wars yielded 2,448 deaths among American soldiers in Afghanistan and about 4,500 in Iraq. Huge things for understanding modern American veterans. Culture is like an extension of history. It is a picture of what an institution or a group of people or an organization looks like today. Here we will discuss elements of American military structure and culture. I don't think it will surprise you to know that the military is a highly structured and it exists outside of the civilian social structure with its own laws and enforcement system for those laws. They have their own courts and their own military police. In the U.S., the structure all starts with the president. The president is the commander in chief, and while he may wear civilian clothes, he still gets saluted by military members. It also has a very clear rank structure, and it's divided into two important groups: enlisted personnel E1 to E9 and officer personnel O1 to O10. These represent very different statuses and very different pay structures. The enlisted get paid significantly less than the officers, and the officers typically have significantly more education than the enlisted. They're so different, they have rules about how these two groups are allowed to interact. Like any other culture, the military has its own symbols and language. They have slangs and acronyms, symbols that represent different branches and subgroups within those branches. They also have their own norms and values. Each branch has different, but they do have common themes about the important values that they hold. The common themes include, in almost all branches, honor, duty, and commitment. Almost always commitment to a group above and beyond the self. This is super important because in American culture, we're known for individualism, and the American military is a culture that is set against that individualism. Before we look at veterans, let's look at the distribution of the armed services before they became veterans. This is important because veterans take elements of these subcultures into their civilian lives. The Army has historically been the largest service with 36% of people in that service. The Marines have historically been the smallest. They're known as the first to fight. We send them in there first, secure an area, and then hand it over to the other forces to maintain. Women represent about 17% of the military. While this may not seem like a lot to people, keep in mind in 1973 it was 2% or less. And that 17% is very similar to other Western nations today. About 6% of the forces are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. If you look at the distribution of race, like the general public in America, the majority of people in the military are white at 72%. However, there's slightly more Hispanics in the military than the general public, about 19% versus 22% in the military. The 19% of African Americans is significantly higher than the 14 or 15% that we find in the general public. So in these ways, in some ways, the military actually represents a more diverse population of people than we find in the civilian world. And a total of 1,355,000 people are paid to be in service today. Of them, 15% or so are officers, 85% are enlisted. The officers typically have a 4-year college degree. Enlisted folks typically do not. They must almost always have a GED, or a actual high school degree, but they're not required to have a college degree. So what can we surmise from understanding something about veteran culture based on military culture? Well, clearly it's going to be dominated by the norms and values coming out of the Army because of the largest branch. It's going to be primarily male and masculine and somewhat more diverse, at least in the area of race, than the general public. So what does the veteran population look like today? According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there were 16 million veterans in the United States in 2022, representing about 6% of the total civilian population 18 and over. You should also know that the percentage of people who are veterans has generally gone down in the last 30 or 40 years. Fewer people have served in the military, from 18% in 1980 to 8% in 2014 to 6% today. See in this graph that the number of World War II and Korean vets is under 1 million today, and we have a large number of Vietnam veterans still alive. The Gulf War era veterans, which includes Operation Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan, are also a large group. I also want to do a special call out to peacetime veterans who didn't serve during a conflict. It's a sizable group and something that should be remembered because we tend to focus on people who have gone to wars. This will come up throughout the semester. In summary, this chapter and my additional information gives you some of the things you need to know about the military before individuals become veterans in the first place. The assumption is that they bring military culture into veteran culture. So we need to know something about the military before we can study veterans. Here we looked at military norms and values, some basic information about its history, the size and scope of each branch. And I want to conclude by reminding you that there's much more on this topic than a single chapter or lecture can cover, and I encourage you to go look up that information if it interests you in any way.